I'm a middle-aged British man who's been an environment and development scholar and activist and consultant now for over a quarter of a century. And in that time I've lived much of my time outside the UK and in the global south. And I've always been driven by the idea that it's good that we become smarter about the problems we face, and in that way we can reduce them. And I guess I still believe that, or suffer from that illusion, because I do so much writing, teaching, for example, the new book. Deep adaptation has become an umbrella term for an ethos, framework, community and movement. The ethos is essentially a commitment to working together to do what's going to be helpful during greater disruption and even collapse of societies because of the direct and indirect impacts of environmental breakdown, including climate change. So it's an ethos. It's an ethos for being engaged in an open-hearted, open-minded way about how we can be and how we can respond. It's also a framework to help people explore ideas for how to respond. And that's, I've called that the 4 R's of deep adaptation, because it's essentially 4 questions. The first question is about resilience. It's what do we most value that we want to keep? Second question is about relinquishment. So what is it that we could let go of to avoid making matters worse? The third question I label restoration, which is, what is it that we could bring back into our lives, into our societies, that could help us in the future? And the fourth R, I call reconciliation. So it's with what and with whom could we make peace with as we wake up to our common mortality and the common difficulties we face. So that's the framework. But and what's key is that these are questions. They're deliberately not answers, because this was when I woke up to this realization of the extent of the damage already being done and that's coming our way because of environmental breakdown. It was very, very troubling to me, and I felt like we didn't have ways of talking to each other about it, and that actually rushing to answers, quick fixes, would mean that we weren't as creative and curious as we could be. And so with that idea, I founded with other people, with a group of people, something called the Deep Adaptation Forum. So that's why I say deep adaptation is also a community now, formed of thousands of participants and hundreds of volunteers from all around the world. And there are regular events online, perhaps even now, because they're happening all the time. And the community at the moment is quite focused on how to support each other with the emotional processing involved in anticipating disruption and collapse, and also skill sharing about how to hold space with each other, how to dialogue, how to help each other work out what we want to do in our own lives and our work going forward. Some people have also started talking about deep adaptation as a new movement, and I do keep hearing of people around the world using the deep adaptation concept, ethos, framework of questioning and dialogue in their own ways. For example, I was delighted to discover that there's a deep adaptation group in southern India, and then I reached out to them to find out what they were doing, and I heard this amazing story of how they had been meeting every month to talk about things like growing their own food, working on water security, natural medicines, all these sorts of things, basically to build their own resilience in the face of potential disruption to the normal economic way of life. But when the pandemic hit, and when the policies kicked in, the lockdowns, and they discovered that there were thousands of migrant workers in the local town in Pondicherry, they were ready to mobilize to actually then help them with food and legal advice and support. And I think that shows you what's possible when people are actually anticipating there's going to be unprecedented disruptions to their way of life, and they've actually been not pushing the ideas away. They're actually able to show up in open hearted, open-minded dialogue about how bad could this be and who do we want to be when life gets more disrupted. And it's through that process they actually were able to immediately not just focus on themselves, but be ready to act in solidarity with people in the local town less fortunate than themselves. Wow. Well, one of the biggest drivers of societal disruption and collapse, even in the near future, is the environmental damage already done. For instance, everyone around the world is being affected either by COVID-19 or the policies in response to that. And the United Nations has confirmed in mid-2020, looking at all the research, that we're going to be getting more and more diseases spilling over from animal populations because of the damage we've done to their habitats and because of the way we've destabilized the climate, which therefore puts more pressure on ecosystems and wildlife. So that's called zoonotic spillover. And so, for example, coronaviruses used to only give people the common cold, like for centuries, but in the last 16 years we've had 3 types of coronavirus that can kill people, and that's an example of what's likely in the future. Now, because some epidemiologists expect that, they've been doing quite risky research in hundreds of labs around the world, which government research from the US shows leads to regular lab leaks. So whatever the origin of COVID-19 turns out to be, if we ever know, we're just generally in an era of pandemics, and our responses to that new era also causes lots of problems and lots of risk. But aside from disease, there's just the simple issue of our food supply. The environmental and climatic changes already underway have been identified by the UN Food and Agricultural Organization as leading to disruptions to food supply and key grains, and one of the reasons why food prices are now increasing as fast as they have worldwide for a decade. And some of the latest food security research is really quite frightening about the possibility of what's called a multi-breadbasket failure occurring once we're over 1.5 degrees global ambient warming. So then, aside from that, we also need to look at how there's a lot of future warming that's already locked in because of the amount of carbon that's already in the atmosphere and the amount of heat that is already stored in the oceans. And that's going to cause further problems for food supply and future pandemic risk. And then, of course, there's the complex and really worrying situation with the self-reinforcing feedbacks in nature, where the natural world is amplifying what we've done to it. Because we put so much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere, that's changed the environment already, over about 1.2 degrees global ambient warming. And that's all, and we've also degraded so many of the natural sinks, like forests and wetlands. So one example of those feedbacks is the Amazon rainforest, which used to be a huge sink for carbon. But what some of the latest research has shown is that actually it's becoming a net source of carbon. That's because of drying soils and because of forest fires. And the Amazon is not alone around the world for that impact. That may be, it seems to be, why in 2020, although we saw human carbon emissions go down by about 7% worldwide, atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide continued to increase. And that really does indicate that there are self-reinforcing feedbacks. I'm not a specialist on it, and the specialists on these feedback mechanisms did a summary study where they find evidence that 9 of the really important 15 feedbacks look like they may have already begun. And then if we look at the kinds of policy changes, like real deep economic governance policy changes to reorient societies and the kind of lifestyle changes that we need to see to significantly reduce emissions and reduce future climate change. We're not seeing it. We're seeing lots of political trends in the opposite direction as well. So that's why increasing numbers of scientists and scholars are speaking out and saying we must do all that we can to try and reduce the risk, but we also now must prepare for the worst. And so hundreds of scholars from over 30 countries signed an international scholars' warning on the risk now of societal disruption and even collapse, and the need to start looking at how to get ready to reduce the harm from that. I think that generally there are two types of critics. The first are people who've heard criticism from others, and they've heard that it's somehow incorrect or unhelpful to anticipate collapse or to work on deep adaptation. And they think that that's reasonable criticism. So that at the moment they've concluded to not focus on this idea, not embrace it. Second, there are people who are professionals within the environmental sector, and they actually think that it's either scientifically wrong or counterproductive to work on societal breakdown and collapse. They think it's counterproductive to actually trying to reduce the risk. I think I'll start with the second type to begin with. Typically, I ask experts in this field to recognize that there's a bias in us towards normality, where we think that what's normal in our everyday experience will continue, like the buses coming on time, the supermarket shelves being stocked, and so on. And that's been shaken somewhat by the pandemic, this assumption of the future will be more like the present. But the normality bias shows up in our discussion about the latest climate science and the latest information on environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. It means that if you anticipate that everything that we experience as normal, then you anticipate that everything will change, therefore. This is the key in terms of our emissions and our impact on the environment, that all of that will change everywhere super fast, and that we'll get lucky that will be enough to stave off societal breakdown. Then the mainstream scientific establishment doesn't demand that you prove that everything not only can but is changing that fast and will have that positive impact. So when I anticipate collapse, all I'm doing is anticipating that all the trends we see now in terms of environmental impacts and political processes are just going to continue to occur in similar ways. So, for example, if we look at anthropogenic carbon emissions, they've continued to increase near exponentially since the start of the Industrial Revolution, with only a couple of blips in 2008 and 2020. Although now in 2021, despite anthropogenic carbon emissions going down, as I've said, it's about 7% in a year, we still see atmospheric carbon emissions increasing. And in any case, we've rebounded. Anthropogenic carbon emissions are increasing as fast as ever. So why should it need to be proven that these emissions will continue before assessing the implications of them continuing? It's purely a bias. And it's the same if we look at, say, indicators of sea level rise, or the loss of Arctic ice, the loss of land ice, the increase in droughts and floods, the loss of biodiversity, the release of methane from on-land permafrost. We see similar trends across the board. Why should it need to be proven that all these trends will continue in the same way as now before actually saying, let's actually seriously look at the implications of them doing so? Same with the impacts on society, zoonotic disease, damage to food supply, storm damage, rising insurance costs. The trends are really bad. why should it need to be proven that they're going to continue before we actually look at what that will mean for our society? I think our societies are highly complex, and so it's a fool's game to try and work out exactly what impact will kind of break the cultural camel's back and lead to an unraveling of society. And in my work in the deep adaptation field and people working in the collapsology field, we're not really spending a lot of time to be precise about exactly what will happen when, because we're really motivated to try and actually do something about it to reduce the harm during those processes. And also because so much of the emphasis on measurement and projection is just within a particular paradigm of like what is statistical significance, and that can all be debated. It doesn't necessarily bring us closer to the truth of the situation and help us really mobilize to get ready. The psychological or the cultural impacts of people waking up to their vulnerability, the kind of psychosocial stress that could occur about that could cause problems, could even hasten disruption of societies. But I think it doesn't have to be that way. If more of us are prepared to face the situation now and support each other in processes to actually bear witness to the difficult emotions, to not act from them, and to find ways of recommitting to being curious and compassionate and creative about the implications, then I think there's definitely a lot that we can learn and a lot that we can do better, no matter what comes next. Indeed, there's a lot of evidence against the argument that to anticipate collapse will lead to apathy. The evidence is available through just talking to climate activists, paying attention to the life stories of some of the leaders in movements like Extinction Rebellion. They say quite clearly that their realization that climate change is not just some far-off concern, but actually is impacting people everywhere right now and is going to get worse no matter what we do, and really therefore condemns so much of our way of life and our values and the way we've worked over the past decades. That is such a kind of like an existential challenge, which is why they transform their life and become full-time activists with far less compromise with the existing systems. I think what's a problem is that quite a lot of people in environmental psychology have really focused on what's called behavioral psychology. So they're interested in, and behavioral economics as well, so they're interested in how can we encourage people to make a greener shopping choice or recycle more. And then, so they've looked at people as consumers rather than as citizens, activists, or potentially community leaders. And that's really not a sound basis for actually looking at the potential for actual radical or even revolutionary change. So yeah, I don't think that those people who say that to anticipate collapse will lead to apathy really have much of a basis in theory or data or experience for that claim. I think there is a really powerful place on the other side of the initial despair, and that's about finding out and recommitting to doing what's right no matter what comes. So return to the first type of critic, people who listen to the professional critics, the environmentalists who say, no, don't anticipate collapse, no, don't listen to the deep adaptation people, don't listen to the collapsology people. I'd reply as follows. First, to anticipate collapse is scary, and it involves getting your head around a lot of complicated assessments. But there are lots of scholars now who are anticipating it. It's not just one random person or outspoken critic. Hundreds of scholars around the world are speaking out about this. Second, we haven't seen any new scientific findings on environmental damage and climate change that say, oh, it's okay, it's better than we said it was before. The trend of in knowledge on climate is that it is worse than it was thought before. Third, there are vested interests that don't want anyone with power to anticipate societal disruption and collapse. They don't want that idea to spread because it will affect their business interests. Fourth, to anticipate collapse doesn't mean giving up. It simply means continuing to push for what's best while preparing for the worst. It's certainly not giving up, it's just opening up to a wider agenda. Fifth, there's now evidence that the militaries of the world, national militaries, armies and so on, are planning already in their scenarios for the future, planning for there being greater disruption and even collapse in global supply chains. And the way they're looking at this is to then think about how do they maintain the capability for war. That's understandable they would look at it in that way, but obviously if the world's militaries are beginning to talk like this and plan, this is deeply concerning. We need to have people in other parts of society with different values, different aims, different mandates, talking about this, engaging with this and coming up with policies both nationally but also internationally. Looking back, I think improvisational theatre was actually quite important, strangely enough, particularly in the way I responded after my climate paper went viral. So it was back in 2017, and I was taking a year off university, unpaid sabbatical, to actually study the climate science because I was feeling quite worried about where we were at with the environment. But prior to my time off, I'd been working in the UK general election of 2017 for the Labour Party as a communications strategist and speechwriter for the leader, Jeremy Corbyn. I was doing that because I really welcomed the values that he was bringing back into public discourse, you know, solidarity, fairness, and a radical approach. But after I did that work, I felt I really wanted to, because we took the majority from the Conservative Party, but we didn't win enough seats to form a government. So I decided to go somewhere else in the world that was cheap and also politically very interesting. So I'd heard that there was an area in Athens called Exarchia, which is an anti-authoritarian neighborhood where it's kind of like constructive anarchism, where they were squatting buildings to open refugee centres for Syrian refugees and doing all kinds of mutual aid projects to help people after the economic collapse there, and also experimenting with alternative currencies. And I just, after what had happened in 2017, and I wanted to get my year started in this unusual year started in a creative way. And there are only so many late night conversations you can have about politics. So after a few weeks in Athens, my flatmate said, why don't we go tonight to an improv theatre group? And I had no idea what that meant. So I went just to see, because I thought, well, let's do it. And we went to this disused theatre called Embros, and you go in and so it's all painted black, and you've got the red velvet seats, and you've got the stage there, and it's an empty and fairly disused theatre. And yeah, the improv, I had no idea. So we just started playing games, interacting, and then we moved to the period where actually so-called scenes would be done. So we had the facilitators say, okay, I want 2 volunteers up on stage now, and you give them a situation and they just start improvising, making stuff up. And that seemed so scary to me. And I've learned so much from why it felt so scary. But there was one game where anyone in the audience, so I'm in the audience, anyone could just shout, freeze. And the people on stage, in whatever position they were doing, whatever scene they were playing, they would both freeze in that position. And then the person who shouted freeze would get up on stage, tap one of them, who would then leave the stage, and they would take up the body position of the person acting, and then they would switch it. They would say something and do a body movement and say something in a dialogue which would completely change the story, who they were, where they were, and so on. And it was, you know, obviously fascinating to watch. But the whole time it was like, oh, can I do this? I mean, and I realized that when you shout freeze, they're not going to freeze immediately, so you're not going to know what body position they're in. You're not going to know what you're going to say. You're going to have to just stand up and start walking onto stage, not knowing anything about what you're going to do. But I saw my flatmate get up and do it. I saw his girlfriend get up and do it. I saw that there was an enthusiasm for whatever anyone would do. It didn't have to be particularly interesting. It was just, there was that positive encouragement. So I thought, well, if I don't do it now, I might never do it. And I also realised there was no particular moment to shout freeze. So then I just shouted freeze, and then just saw what they were doing, and walked up on stage and adopted the body posture and started acting for the first time in my life, improvising in front of a group of people. And I don't remember much about it, but I think I remember at one point I was acting where I was on my knees pleading with the other person. So clearly I had panic in me, and I found that as the place from which to act. And I think that's what I've learned as well, is with improv, it's just let the emotion lead you. And looking back, I discovered a lot that night, and more over time. I discovered that a big part of my fear was a sense of insecurity about how I might be perceived, how I might therefore be accepted or feel shame. So that's connected to an assumption or a habit of controlling how I interact with other people, and how I want to be deliberate about how I want to show up. So I think I had quite an attachment to planning. And with improv theatre, you can't do that. It's all about letting go of the need to be in control. It's letting go of the need to know what comes next. Letting go of the need to sort of have an influence on how people will perceive you. And it's also about trusting in emergence. Basically, you get up there and you pay attention to whoever you're on stage with, and you just you flow with them, whatever they're doing, wherever they're at. And you also let emotion lead. And it brings a different quality, a totally different quality, that what can emerge from that, from if you were just sitting down and trying to write a play or just decide what would be the next interesting thing to occur. So I became a regular in the improv group. I even then, when I moved to a different place, I set up an improv group and became a facilitator. I even incorporate it in my teaching now. Sometimes I've been facilitating groups of over 30 people. And yeah, this has really shaped the rest of my work, and even I think my personality. It means that I'm more comfortable about the idea of just getting started in something and paying attention to the situation, other people, and working with them and seeing what emerges. Also, I think I've really focused on the importance of a few basic principles for how you interact, and trusting emergence, trusting what needs to happen will happen. So yeah, I'm interested in how we create the conditions to improv our way into a difficult future for humanity. I don't think there's a simple answer. I don't think anyone who says you know exactly what to do is actually someone we should be listening to. We need to help each other find our own ways forward, locally, nationally, globally. So yeah, I think improv, it helps with that spirit of emergence, paying attention, courage, trust in emergence as well, creativity. I've even started describing it as great therapy for recovering control freaks. Yeah, opinion research shows that large percentages of the general public in many Western countries already anticipate societal collapse in their own countries. And significant numbers of people believe it's going to happen within a couple of decades. So that kind of anticipation can lead to positive or problematic responses for individuals, communities and societies, depending on how we help each other process the difficult emotions, explore possible implications in our own lives. Now, unfortunately, mainstream media, politicians, and also people involved in campaigning often don't welcome such difficult conversations. And so they're really only heard in private. And so people, and even people who speak out, can be maligned and try to sort of be pushed back into silence. So the deep adaptation ethos, framework, community and movement are all now helping people to process those emotions, find out how to engage positively from a place of anticipating disruption and collapse. Working out together with people what to do in their lives and their organisations. It's so much more, deep adaptation is so much more than one academic paper or one professor or one group of scholars. It really is much wider than that. And so an edited book, I think, is the best way to help show people and introduce people to that breadth of ideas and how so many people around the world are engaging this and finding it useful, how they really want to find positive ways of responding to the difficult situation we're in. I think it's helpful for people in senior positions to become aware of just how seriously scholars in different disciplines around the world now consider the risk of societal disruption and collapse and are working on it. So a scholarly book bringing together thinkers in a variety of disciplines as well as some activists seemed to me to be a helpful way of conveying that. So I was pleased to work with Professor Rupert Read as co-editor for the book because he's had a somewhat similar journey to myself. In his case, working also decades on environmental issues, but for him within the Green Party and as a scholar. In my case, working with environmental NGOs at the United Nations and with the Labour Party. We were very fortunate to get some incredible contributors who are really leaders at the forefront of their field. So people like Professor Jonathan Gosling, a leading academic on leadership studies, but also Professor Vanessa Andriotti, a leading educator in the field of both decolonisation and educational theory. And also for me, one of the most important spiritual guides and teachers for activists, Joanna Macy. If you visit one of the platforms of the Deep Adaptation Forum, you'll see a range of approaches from people. They include a focus on emotional support, education, local resilience, organisational change, political activism. There's been a focus in the first couple of years on inner work, as well as dialogue and social learning. A key has been how to practice, how to stay present to the predicament facing humanity so we don't become numb or hasty or defensive or vengeful. Instead, to explore more openly about what we can do at this time. Everyone can and will find their own way of coping or even thriving within a new context. But that context is going to include more disruption for our lives, less certainty about the future, less acceptance of current norms. It's happening already around us and within us. How we cope or how we thrive depends on collaboration, privilege, luck. Those of us who have the privilege and luck may want to do more than simply just focus on self-preservation. My case is a bit unusual, that I don't have a family, but I had a successful career and living quite frugally. So it meant I could take a year off unpaid to explore what to do. So I wanted to contribute to greater readiness, harm reduction and meaning making. On the one hand, I was fearful about how some people might respond aggressively to their anticipation of disruption and collapse. But on the other hand, I was stunned at how heart-opening this realization was for many people, including myself. I wanted to help nourish that kind of response and stay in that kind of response. So the transformation I was going through meant I couldn't compromise so much with the current system and and my way of life. So key has been my view that I don't need to save for the long term. Doesn't feel sensible. I would be grateful but also surprised if I'm alive in the 2030s and that we've got similar financial systems to now and I've got the same kind of opportunities then as now. So for me, that sense of the future hasn't led me to, say, hedonism or profligacy. It's meant throwing myself into stuff that I felt really important, with less compromise. So when I rejoined academia, it was only working 2 days a week and focusing exclusively on what I believe is still useful to do, such as research and education and outreach on critical leadership for social change. So that meant I could work for free for 2 days a week for 2 years on supporting and growing this global movement on deep adaptation. I arranged remote working and moved to a country where I had a far simpler and cheaper life. I've also rented a house for the next 7 years rather than buying one. And I'm also looking at investing in agricultural land so that I'll have something that's useful if the financial system goes down in the coming years. I don't really want lots of dead stuff like gold or silver, but I want something that's alive now and will be alive and helpful for people in the future. It's also been a busy few years on the intellectual stuff. I've still some way to go on that. I'm creating courses that hopefully will be able to run on their own without me. I'm helping more scholars look at this topic and communicate better. I'm finishing a book on my own personal take on the situation. But I also want to make more time in my life for local resilience work, for also my own inner stuff, how I wish to be as a person day to day. I have unfulfilled spiritual yearnings. I'm spending more time working with helping a Buddhist temple locally. It's clearly positive that there's a new emphasis on adaptation to climate change from World Bank, European Commission, and various intergovernmental agencies. But research on the mainstream adaptation policy agenda has found that it's too limited and it's even counterproductive. For instance, scholars like IPCC author Lisa Schipper of Oxford University find that so much of what is done in the name of climate adaptation is trying to patch up situations which can't continue and actually often add to inequality. So deep adaptation is named in contrast to that kind of shallow adaptation. It has more in common with things like transformative adaptation, which are based on the idea that everything will change and we need to work with that assumption. So I hope people in the mainstream climate adaptation field will look at this book and see that it helps provide a different lens for their existing work, questioning what they're doing, continuing with a whole range of what they're doing, but also maybe dropping some things and also recognizing that we need to also prepare for some of the worst case scenarios. And hope that can have some impact for the best. But do it anyway, because it's meaningful to do.